Christoph, you've got some pretty interesting supplies right here, and it's interesting to see what you've brought and that you are tapping so many different types of trees, but here we have a very unique maple, not our typical sugar maple, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is a red maple, which grows throughout Virginia, and you can also tap a red maple tree just like a sugar maple. You won't get quite as much sugar from it. The percentage is a little bit lower, but you can tap it, boil it down, and make syrup just the same as sugar maple.
But these grow more throughout Virginia, where sugar maples are really up in the mountainous areas.
In the high country, exactly.
Yes, yes, and that's why we do have the most southern sugar maple forest, I'll say, not forest, but syrup production here in Virginia. Just a little bragging point.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, tiny tidbit of information. So, but the actual tapping of the tree, would you tap a tree this size?
This tree is a little small. This is my travel size tree
Yes.
that I brought with us today. Normally in the woods, you wouldn't tap anything that's smaller than 10 inches diameter, and you get a lot more sap from something a bit bigger. 15, 18 inches diameter is a great tree to tap.
How far apart do you put the taps on a tree?
So you would only put one tap on a smaller tree. A tree larger than 18 inches, you could put 2 taps in, and then when you get to the really large trees, 30 inches or larger, then you might start considering 3 taps. And they need to be, basically, if you're tapping them in the same season, you want them to be on different sides of the tree so that you're not extracting that precious resource from the same spot in the tree.
Okay, and then the next year, do you rotate it, or do you go to a different tree? Or?
Yeah, so the tap does leave a little bit of scar tissue. Just like if we were to have a little cut, there would be a scar the next year. Same thing happens to the tree. And so you want to avoid that scarred area and go at least 6 inches over and a foot up, basically trying to avoid that area so you're tapping into fresh sapwood.
Excellent. So you don't end up girdling the tree accidentally.
That's exactly right, because the most important thing to us is to not over-tap the trees. We want them to be healthy for years and years to come.
That's your resource.
Exactly.
Yes. So how do you tap a tree?
Well, what we do is pretty much something you can do with tools you may have at home. We're going to take a power drill, and the size of the bit corresponds to the size of the tap that we're using. And we're going to find a spot on the tree that hasn't been tapped yet before. Like I said, a few inches over and up. And in this case, we're going to find a spot right here. It looks pretty good. And then we're going to drill a hole in about between 1.25 inches and 1.5 inches into the tree. There we go. And then we take this tap. Now this is made just for sugaring, as they call it. This is a tap that's meant to go into the tree. This is actually one of the experimental taps that we're working with. You insert it by hand, and then just a few gentle taps until it's snug.
Okay.
There we go. And if this were a tree in the woods, we would probably start to see the first little drops coming out.
Immediately.
Exactly.
Well, when do you know when to put the taps in the wintertime?
It's a great question. We just finished our sugaring season up in Highland County. We're looking for the time of year when basically winter is breaking, when we have nice cold temperatures at night. It goes below freezing at night and then above freezing in the daytime. And it's that freeze-thaw cycle that really contributes to the sap flow, the sap movement. And it's a relatively short window, typically about 6 weeks in late winter, early spring. This year it was even shorter, about 3.5 weeks was our sugaring season. So it's the weather and the forest itself that determines that time of year.
What signals that it's stopped?
The trees themselves tell us that they're done. Now there are a number of factors. First of all, the first sap of the season is going to give us really light colored syrup with a really mild flavor. As temperatures warm up, you're getting more nutrients pushed through the sap because the trees are trying to put leaves out very soon. They're preparing their buds. And so that's going to create a darker, more rich flavored syrup. We reach a certain point when it gets so dark that it's an overbearing flavor. It just doesn't taste good. And at the same time, the sap flow is going to slow down as well. Basically, the tree is healing that little tap hole that we've made, and it's telling us it's time to stop.
Yes, it's doing COVID, but anyway. Compartmentalization anyway.
Exactly.
The other question I had is, how many miles of tubing do you have at Tenalaway Farm?
Yeah, that's a great question. In the old days, they would use buckets on each tree, right?
Yes.
And you would haul the buckets in. We have over 1,600 taps, and
wow.
We don't have the labor to carry all those buckets in. So we use this tubing, which is made for transporting the sap. Small tubes connect to bigger tubes. The bigger tubes flow downhill, and that all goes to our collection tanks. And so that's sort of a more let's say, labor-efficient way of harvesting sap. And to answer your question, I would estimate we have at least 5, maybe 5.5 miles of tubing in our forests.
Interesting. How do you clean all that tubing?
It's a great question because as spring comes, it warms up. you get a little bit of bacterial growth in the tubing, which is not something that you want in your syrup. And so we flush them with clean water every spring to make sure that we're getting all the gunk out, and then we close them up so that nothing can get into the lines during the off season.
Excellent, excellent. Well, speaking of sap, what did you bring for us?
Well, what we're doing is we're going to demonstrate how we check to make sure we've made syrup, because essentially to get from here to finished syrup, there's a lot in between. We boil it over a wood fire in a big pan, a 2-foot by 6-foot pan, and you can imagine the amount of firewood that goes into to boiling that for literally days on end. But as the steam rises up, we go from 70 gallons of sap to give us 1 gallon of syrup.
That's amazing.
And that's the ratio for the black walnut trees. With maple trees, it's a little bit better. But all of that depends on the sugar concentration coming out of the tap.
Yeah, so that more water, you've got to boil it longer.
Exactly. But then the question, how do we know when we're done? We're looking for the sugar percentage. It's a term called bricks. We're looking for 67 bricks. That's the sweet spot, pardon my pun, to tell us that we've got finished syrup. And what we can do is actually check that by looking at the density of the syrup. To check the density, we use something called a hydrometer, and we're going to float that in our syrup. And you can see these red lines. That corresponds to a specific density of syrup. Normally, this would be calibrated at well over 200 degrees. We don't want to have that on the table here, and so you can see that it's floating a little high.
Yes.
If this was at 200 degrees, that red line would be right flush with the syrup, and that's how we know we finished it.
Absolutely perfect. Wonderful. So I'm very eager to taste all this syrup because, as you know, I mentioned earlier, back in my younger years, I used to tap and boil and create our own syrups when we lived up in New York. And so I'm kind of a connoisseur, so show me, Christoph.
Absolutely. I'm happy to share. Now, what we have to begin with, this is classic maple syrup. It's got a nice amber color. And I mean, a lot of people don't even know that we can make maple syrup in Virginia. And so this is a real treat to be able to share this flavor. And these are all from trees tapped in Highland County. And yeah, I'd invite you to have a taste first of the classic maple syrup.
Yes. Wonderful. Delicious.
I hope it compares well to what you've tried before.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to get a little bit more interesting,
yes,
we, as you know, we tap black walnut trees. And that's fairly unusual, but it's also a very old tradition. And it takes roughly 7 times as many trees to get the same amount of syrup.
That intrigues me, yes.
Yeah, and 7 times as much work to produce it, which is why I'm tired. It's been a long season, and this gives us this wonderful syrup. This is maple syrup mixed with black walnut syrup, and I'll have you try that before we get to the pure stuff.
Oh, well, we've got a minute left, sir, so. Oh, I like that combination. Yes.
A little more complexity.
A little more complexity, yes. Not so sweet.
Exactly. And now, last but not least, I'd like you to try the pure black walnut syrup, which is sort of a precious commodity.
Oh, that's delicious. I'm a black walnut fan, though. But boy, the aftertaste on the tongue, I highly recommend this, everybody. This is delicious. So where can I get this? But I'm sure at your farm you have options.
We sell it at the farm. We go to farmers markets in Stanton, Alexandria, and Richmond starting this year. And we also have it available through our website online. We mail all over the U.S. We sent syrup to Hawaii a few weeks ago.
I like the blend and I like the black walnut. The maple is equally as good. So thank you. Christoph, this has been fascinating. And I thank you for giving insight into actually a product that's produced here in Virginia that we kind of all could think we can just go and put it onto the shelf. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes.